This is World War I, as you've never seen it before. This photograph of a battlefield is 100 years old, and it was taken with a 3D camera. It seems unbelievable, but there were people using 3D cameras throughout World War I, and the images they captured have remained largely unseen for decades. They've never been shown on television in their original format before. Now, we've recreated the original stereoscopic effect to bring some of these incredible images back to life and open a lost album of World War I photographs. These pictures enable us to view the war from an entirely new perspective. This is me and my grandpa, Jack Robinson. I reckon it was taken in about 1949. I love his smile, don't you? But just over 30 years previously, he'd come back from the First World War to his little terraced house in Hackney, and he opened the front door, and my grandma had spread out a load of newspaper on the lino, and he took off his uniform, and he took off his shirt, his boots, and his vest, and his pants, and his socks, and he stood there naked on the paper, just looking down at the uniform, and he stepped off it, and my grandma wrapped it all up into a big ball and put it onto the fire, and then they all stared at this big ball of uniform as it burned. And eventually, when it was just a big, charred ball, my grandpa turned round, walked up the stairs to the bedroom, and never spoke about the war ever again. So I don't know what regiment he was in, where he went, what his experiences were. I know absolutely nothing. That's not an uncommon story. Many of the men who fought kept quiet about what happened. All the noise about the war has been made by the generations that followed them. We spent 4.5 years fighting the First World War, and the best part of a century arguing about it. Well, I think those men who fought deserved better. So using these amazing pictures, I want to try and tell my war story. And to do it, I'm going to visit the places where the real action took place.
These were the trenches that those poor guys over there had to attack. And I mean, just look at the angles they've got here.
Use the machines that powered the conflict. Experience the battlefields of 1914. And walk in the footsteps of the men who fought. I want to try and give them their war back. This is a Kaiser Panorama machine, one of the few working models left in the world. It's a viewing device for stereographic images. 3D pictures to you and me. The pictures on show here capture a lost world. One of horse-drawn carriages, of elegance, ambition, sophistication. So how did this civilized, forward-looking, affluent world turn into this? Look at this picture. This is what some parts of Europe looked like after the war. A vision of hell. A place of the dead. How did this happen? Well, before the world self-destructed, it seemed to be in safe hands, her family's hands. Queen Victoria's sons and daughters had married into Europe's greatest families. So 3 of the empires who would fight the war were ruled by her grandsons. That's right, the King of England, George V, the German monarch, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the Russian Emperor, Tsar Nicholas, were all cousins. To get some background on the family firm, I spoke to Katrina Clay, author of Kaiser, King and Tsar.
I think the 3 cousins, if you think of them as Georgie, Willie and Nicky...
It's hard.
Which is hard, the King, the Kaiser and the Tsar, but if you think about them like that, they are part of this massive family, and Queen Victoria is the grandmother. And I would say they're the same as many other families. They love each other and they hate each other, you know. I mean, there's a very strong feeling in that family. And perhaps the one that really, really suffered from that was Willie. None of them liked Willie.
What was the problem with Willie?
He was taken out with his own image, is perhaps one way of putting it. You know, and if you look at the photographs of him, you know, he's absolutely standing there and he's the warlord and he's got one of his 400 uniforms on. And he is quite given to making these extraordinarily bombastic sort of statements, you know, and he calls Parliament that monkey house and all that sort of thing, you know. But actually, he was quite a split person. And underneath, I would say he was sensitive. He was craving affection and attention. He longed for his English family to love him, and they didn't.
Do you think there was a bit of empire envy going on as far as Wilhelm was concerned?
I wouldn't say a bit of empire envy, I would say a lot. I think Wilhelm's own phrase was, we want a place in the sun.
The German generals had the measure of their Kaiser. They knew he was a man easily seduced by the sound of trumpets. And while he and his country were frustrated with the few colonies they did control, the military pushed Willie to sanction a massive arms build-up to compensate for his lack of empire. There were huge investments in the army. Just look at this impressively suited and booted battalion. They also developed bigger and better artillery. And they built a navy that would rival Britain's. None of this won either the Kaiser or his country any friends. However, the rest of Europe had a plan to keep Germany in its place. No one wanted a big European war, so a number of old enemies decided to play nice and enter into treaties with one another. In 1904, Britain ended centuries of hatred towards its rivals across the Channel and signed an alliance with the French. In 1907, France and Russia agreed to jointly declare war on any nation that attacked either one of them. So pick a fight with Russia, and immediately you had to fight France as well. They hoped that would stop Germany from starting any trouble. It left the waning Austro-Hungarian Empire as Germany's only European ally. The irony was that this strategy aimed at preventing a war was the very thing that sucked us into one. I asked historian and journalist Sir Max Hastings what went wrong.
No event in history is inevitable, that nothing has to happen. But one of the things that made the First World War happen was that in 1914, everybody had come to think in Europe that war was inevitable. No one nation deserves all the blame for what happened in 1914. It was the result of a whole range of incredibly complicated issues. And one of the other problems was that in 1914, to us nowadays, a huge European war is something unthinkably dreadful. To them, they regarded war as a usable instrument of policy.
This is how it began, with the murder of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Here's a picture of Ferdinand 4 years earlier in London, at the funeral of King Edward VII, which is why the doomed Archduke is wearing a black armband. This is his killer, a 19-year-old kid called Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb radical. The assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand brought to a head a long-running dispute in the Balkans between Serbia and Austria-Hungary over territory. The old empire had uncovered a plot that linked Princip to the Serbian military. But as Russia had promised to defend Serbia from any attack, Austria-Hungary had to think very carefully about any retaliation. Of course, it also had a heavily armed, aggressive nation on its side too. Its old ally, Germany.
I think Germany deserves more than most of the blame because Germany was the one power that could have stopped it. If at any time during July 1914, after the assassination of the Archduke, the Germans had got on the telephone to Vienna and said, hang on, you better not invade Serbia, this is all going to get way out of hand, we're going to have a huge war. But they didn't make that phone call. So yes, it was an incredibly complicated mixture of forces that brought about this war. But part of the trouble was that nations were crazy enough to think they could get something out of victory, and the Germans were confident they could beat any combination of powers against them.
That confidence would push them into a war which would change the world. With German encouragement, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia on July the 28th, whereupon one by one, countries bound by treaties and self-interest fell into war like a line of dominoes. Within 2 days of war being declared on Serbia, Russia began marshalling its forces. Russia had yet to declare war on anyone, but the sight of it mobilizing its armies was enough to force Germany's hand. And on August the 1st, Germany declared war on the Tsar, the Kaiser's cousin. 2 days after that, it declared war on Russia's ally, France. And here are the Kaiser's troops marching through Berlin on their way to war. As they left, the Kaiser told them that they would be back before the leaves had fallen from the trees. None of them could have known what lay ahead. The war they were starting would destroy this Germany. And most of Europe with it. In August 1914, the time for peace in Europe was over. The murder 1 month before of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne had sent Germany, Russia and France on the road to destruction. The next country to join them would be Britain. What made Britain a military superpower was its navy, which was the biggest and best in the world. The army, meanwhile, was a small, regular force designed to police the colonies. There weren't many of them, but they were all professional soldiers and arguably the best equipped and trained fighting men on the planet. To find out what made the British Tommy tick, I met World War I expert Andy Robertshaw. Andy, how did the British Expeditionary Force compare with the other armies in the First World War? Were we the best?
No question about it, we are the best.
Why is that? Why do you say that?
Because we're a tiny professional army of really well-trained soldiers compared to anybody else in Europe. And we've changed everything, ready for any war that might come along.
Well, certainly, Robin looks the part in his khaki.
He certainly does.
Why khaki?
It's a camouflage colour developed after the Boer War to make sure our soldiers could hide in the landscape.
Milo is dressed as what?
A French soldier of 1914.
He looks like someone out of a Ruritanian operetta, doesn't he?
He certainly does, but the French army knew that. They were planning to change the uniform to something more camouflage. Then the war broke out. They were caught out by the war coming along.
Let's have a look at Robin a bit closer, shall we? Right, well, he's got a big gun.
He's got the rifle, the short magazine Lee Enfield. He should be capable of firing 15 aim shots a minute with it, otherwise he doesn't get his full pay.
And something very scary on the left-hand side.
Bayonet on the left-hand side, designed to be long enough to outreach a German with his rifle and bayonet.
What kind of training would he have had?
Vast amounts of experience, fieldcraft, use of camouflage, use of digging in quickly, and being able to shoot accurately at the enemy with a maximum number of bullets per minute.
His scariest weapon has got to be that moustache. That's a killer, isn't it?
Yes, and enforced by military regulations until 1916. If he can grow a moustache, he has to.
That was the regulations?
Yes.
Well, Robin, you can certainly grow one, can't you?
Thank you very much, sir.
That's all right. So we were a lean, mean, well-drilled fighting machine. But the war that was rapidly approaching was going to depend not on the quality of the soldiers, but on sheer numbers of men. Dangerous moustaches wouldn't be much use in that kind of conflict. When war began, this is how the various national armies lined up in the field. Germany had over 840,000 men. France had roughly the same. Russia, meanwhile, could command 1.25 million troops. Even little Belgium could call on 120,000 men in uniform. The smallest force among them was Britain's, just 82,000. Britain wasn't just low on numbers. Unlike the French and Germans, it also lacked a big artillery, motorised transport, and the heavy equipment needed for modern warfare. So given that Britain was nowhere near ready for the war, why did they march off into battle? The troops were sent off to war because Germany invaded Belgium, rolling their troops and weapons through a country Britain had promised to defend. Germany had no quarrel with Belgium, but it was facing a war with two empires, Russia and its ally France. It chose to fight France first, and the obvious route to attack them was through their shared border. However, this strip of land was heavily defended by the French. They'd concentrated men, guns and forts here and were ready to repel any invasion. So instead, Germany attacked through Belgium, a lightly defended corridor between the two countries. That way, they could bypass the main French forces and march straight to Paris. This plan was thought up in 1905 by a German commander called Schlieffen. While it made tactical sense, politically it was madness, because it meant Germany would be picking a fight with Britain.
On the 30th of July, the Germans sent an ultimatum to London saying, oh, by the way, in our invasion of France, we're going to go through neutral Belgium. I hope you don't mind. Well, this caused a shock in London. Everybody was absolutely stunned. They thought, here is the German army, just to fulfill its great war plan, the Schlieffen plan, it's going to smash through a tiny little neutral country which Britain's the guarantor. And suddenly, the whole mood in Britain, almost overnight, changed. All sorts of people had written in their diaries on the 28th of July, we must have nothing to do with this war. Suddenly, they say, if Germany and the German army are going to smash Belgium, we've got to come in. The Belgians appealed to Britain, and the British government replied, yes, we will support you.
This is Helmut von Moltke, the head of the German army in 1914, and the man who adapted the Schlieffen Plan and then went to war with it. It was a decision that Dr. Karina Urbach believes was political suicide.
It was a disastrous plan, and it didn't leave any room for political maneuver, you know? That was the worst thing. It was a plan. The military ran our country, and that's the disastrous side of the whole story, that we allowed them to take over.
Did the fact that the Germans had this plan in the first place mean that they actually wanted war?
No, no. I think that's where I disagree with some of my British colleagues and the more patriotic British colleagues who think, you know, we were these evil, bloodthirsty Germans. There were lots of misunderstandings. I mean, the Germans, first of all, didn't think that this would be a world war. They thought it can be localized. This is a war, perhaps, okay, Austria-Hungary against Serbia, but they never thought that the Russians would fight for Serbia.
Were there other, more material reasons why Britain decided that it should join?
There was nothing in it for Britain coming into the war. Indeed, a lot of Germans would say to this very day, well, of course Britain didn't want a war in 1914 because Britain had everything already. Britain had a huge empire. Britain controlled the seas of the world. Britain controlled the world's financial system. Britain was almost certainly going to have to fight a victorious Germany at some point. And if it had stayed neutral in 1914, it would have probably had to do so without any allies later, on far worse terms. And I think that going to war for Belgium was a very honourable and right thing to do.
Belgium may have had our sympathy and support, but until the British Army could get over to them, they had to face the invaders on their own. Germany had forecast that they could overrun the country in days. Well, they got that wrong. The Belgians proved they were no pushovers and stubbornly resisted the enemy. This picture was sold as part of a collection of 3D war photographs for the general public. And on the back of the card, it says that the intense-looking guy at the front was hailed as a hero after killing 18 German soldiers. What I can't get over are his eyes. Their resistance delayed the invasion by as much as 18 days. So Germany's plan to invade France and beat them within 6 weeks was already shot to pieces. As their soldiers tried to hold on to their country, thousands of Belgian families began to head for safety in France and Holland. Some even came to Britain. This is what they were escaping. This is a 3D photograph showing what war was doing to their country. These pictures shocked people in Britain, as did images like this of Belgian refugees, widows and orphans sleeping on the floor of the Ali Pali, the Alexandra Palace in London. Even more disturbing were the stories of atrocities committed by German troops.
The reports started to come through about what the German army was doing in Belgium as the German army swept through. Now, some of the stories were straight propaganda, fiction, all the stories of maimed babies. But when the dust settled, and scholars have looked at all this in recent years, the facts are that the German army killed in cold blood, not just casually, they lined up in rows and shot or hanged, about 4,723 perfectly innocent people of all ages and both sexes, really to prove they were absolutely, first of all, they were convinced that the civilians either were already waging guerrilla war against them or might do. So actually not a shred of evidence there was any guerrilla war at all against them. But they were determined to say, we're the masters.
Who were determined? Do you
the
think
German army, and it went right the way up.
You think it did? It wasn't...
We know it was, because there's a paper trail that right the way up, the Kaiser warmly applauding these actions.
Germany was brutal in its ambitions. Meanwhile, Belgium was being reduced to rubble. As the Kaiser's great army continued to smash a path towards Paris, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had landed in France. And look at them. Look at their faces. They're just a bunch of blokes smiling and having a laugh, aren't they? Of course, at this point, they hadn't fired a shot. But all that was about to change very quickly. The first British soldier was about to die. In August 1914, Germany invaded Belgium in order to attack northern France and capture Paris. Britain had sworn to protect Belgium from any threat, and so reluctantly it sent a small force of troops, just 82,000 men, to fight. One thing that's really fascinating me, and to be honest, I'd never actually thought about this before, is that World War I spans the transition between the horse-powered age and the motor-powered age. So the beginning of the war was conducted at the pace of the 19th century rather than the 20th century. And it was in those early days, at the beginning of the war, that the BEF launched its brand new rapid response and reconnaissance force. Yes, the bicycle unit. British soldiers began to arrive in France in the first week of August 1914. The Bicycle Reconnaissance Unit were part of the 4th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, stationed near the Belgian city of Mons. One of the men, well, I say man, he was a boy, really. He was just 16. He was called Private John Parr, and he'd left school at 12. He'd become a golf caddy, but the lure of 3 meals a day and a chance to have a look round the world had got the better of him, and he lied about his age and joined up. So there he was, cycling along on a French country road with his mates, looking for all the world like a young schoolboy on his summer holiday, which is what he should have been. No photograph, 3D or otherwise, exists of Parr, so you'll have to imagine that young boy when I tell you what happened next. Because that morning, Parr and another soldier ran into a cavalry patrol from the German First Army. And when they did, John jumped off his bike, grabbed his rifle, told his mate to ride back and warn his battalion, and then he started firing at the enemy. And no one saw him alive ever again. In the confusion and chaos of the next few weeks, he wasn't even listed as dead. But his mum, when she hadn't heard from him for a few months, got very worried and wrote to the battalion, who said they'd no idea where he was. His death wasn't officially recorded until 1918, although he'd been buried in Belgium 4 years previously. He was the first British soldier to die in Europe since the Battle of Waterloo, almost 100 years before. He was killed before barbed wire and muddy trenches became the landscape of war. He didn't even live long enough to get a tin hat. Before the war was over, his sacrifice would be followed by nearly 1 million British Empire war dead. The first major battle for the British was here in the Belgian city of Mons, and this bridge was the scene of some of the most serious fighting. Mons was protected from the advancing German forces by a canal system, a natural defence that gave the vastly outnumbered British some hope of defending themselves. Battlefield historian Matt McLachlan walked me through the action. Matt, why was this bridge so important?
Well, Tony, the Germans were closing in on the city of Mons, but to get there, they had to get across this canal, and there was only really one way to do that, across a series of bridges on this section of the bank. But of course, the British knew this, so this was where they massed their forces. They set them up and they waited for the Germans to attack.
So how heavy was the fighting?
The fighting was really severe here. This was really savage, cutthroat fighting. I think it's interesting when we think about the First World War, we think about British soldiers marching into German machine guns, but it wasn't like that at the start. Here, a couple of British machine guns were able to absolutely decimate the Germans as they tried to cross.
This stereoscopic photograph shows a 5-man British machine gun crew at work. In the firefight at the Mons Canal, a similar crew to this would write their names into history. It was because of those machine guns that this memorial was put up, wasn't it?
That's right. This is one of the most vital spots on the entire battlefield. And in fact, this was where the first 2 Victoria Crosses of the war were won, right where we're standing.
What happened?
Well, there were 2 guys. It happened just up here on this bank.
Yeah.
There was a lieutenant, Lieutenant Dees, and a private, Private Godley. And both of them were members of machine gun sections. They were manning machine guns here. And just picture the scene. Germans were massing on that side of the canal and desperately trying to get across the bridge. These 2 machine guns held them up and caused huge numbers of casualties.
Private William Holbrook of the Royal Fusiliers gave an eyewitness account of what happened. We were on the bank, we had a bit of cover. The worst part was on the bridge. A number got killed there. Lieutenant Dees, in charge of the machine gun party, was wounded 3 times. But he still went to the gun. Godley was firing there. Dees died there, leaving Godley in charge. There were some village kids quite near the canal bank, and I remember Godley shouting at them, "Get out of the way, get away!" The Germans started crossing the bridge. Godley had sense enough to pitch the gun into the water, so they couldn't use it on us as we retreated.
Unfortunately, Lieutenant Dees was mortally wounded and Private Godley was eventually captured by the Germans. But both of them were considered to have done such great work as the last men in their sections that they were both awarded the Victoria Cross.
It's funny, it's such an inconsequential-looking little mound, isn't it? The thought that an act of great heroism took place here is quite extraordinary. Over 1,600 British soldiers were wounded or lost that day, and by nightfall, the order was given to retreat. Pursued by the Germans, the exhausted BEF troops marched 200 miles and they were attacked all the way. To try and slow down the Germans, the British Army blew bridges and fought desperate rearguard actions. Mons survivor Holbrook remembered this demoralising experience. A lot of the men fell out of the retreat and had to be picked up. Some were in a bad way. Their feet were so bad they were bleeding. Some were left behind. You couldn't get them all back. This grisly photograph shows what happened to one of the British supply lines on that march. Men and horses slaughtered by an artillery barrage after being spotted by a German plane. It's stomach-churning, isn't it? The Allied retreat had been so spectacular that it tempted the Germans to abandon their advance on Paris and instead try to encircle the Allies, who were now gathered near the Marne River. But this meant that their forces were now dangerously strung out and vulnerable.
This army, the German army, was getting terribly tired. These are civilians who've only been in uniform for a couple of weeks, that they're wearing new boots, that most of them are terribly footsore. They've lost more casualties who can't walk anymore than they had to French and British gunfire. Its horses were worn out. Everybody forgets. There weren't a lot of tanks. There were no panzer divisions. This is an army that's dependent for its supplies and for everything on horses, horses, horses. They're saddle sore, they're exhausted, they're badly fed. So they've got horses and men cracking up in all directions.
The Allies saw the widening gap in the strung-out German forces and sent in the BEF and the 5th French Army to attack. In an instant, the 1st and 2nd German armies were threatened with encirclement and destruction. When the German commander Moltke heard what had happened, he did what I would have done in a similar situation. He had a nervous breakdown. The French government declared there would be no more retreat and brought in more troops by train and even by taxi from Paris itself. In the fierce fighting that followed, the course of the war changed.
The Germans had driven right back across a very broad front, and their chances of achieving the quick victory that everything hinged on in their war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, wrecked. The Schlieffen Plan's over, this great fantasy, and the shape of the war is changed. And most intelligent Germans realized by about September the 10th, 1914, they weren't going to get their quick victory. This was going to turn very nasty. And over the couple of months that followed, it did turn very nasty.
This is a photograph of one of the wrecked bridges on the Marne, with the steam train just sprawled out across the tracks and onto the river. And it's a glimpse of the future of what this new industrial war of superpowers was capable of. The Battle of the Marne raged for 3 days, and the loss of life and devastation it caused was enormous. A shocking 500,000 casualties split between both sides. So many died, the bodies were left in shallow graves with just a spade of earth to cover their faces. When the battle was finished and the Germans had retreated, the disgraced Moltke presented himself to the Kaiser and told him, "It's all over. Germany has lost the war." Unfortunately for all those involved, it would take another 4 years before his judgment was proved correct. Following the battle, both sides began to dig in before trying to outflank each other. They fought and raced their way to the coast, all the time keeping the battle moving. In the end, they were both brought to a halt by the Belgians, who, sensing the oncoming storm, opened their dams and canal locks and flooded the lowland near the sea.
And autumn comes, and it starts raining, and the weather goes downhill. And shellfire starts to wreck the field drains. And suddenly, in October, November 1914, all those wonderful blue coats and red trousers and all those horsemen wearing horsehair plumes on their helmets, that's all gone. What you've got instead are the armies sinking into the earth, that you're getting the first trench lines. And all along this incredible front, from Switzerland to the sea, that suddenly you've got the armies sinking into the earth and the Germans still pounding on and pounding on.
These early trenches were built by French soldiers. They're such crude structures, aren't they? Posts hammered in by a big mallet and branches woven in amongst it to keep it solid and dry. Now, soldiers who had been told they'd be home for Christmas were getting the news they'd be spending a winter or more fighting in these crude shelters. The trenches began to link together, like a fault line dividing the superpowers, a vast physical split that ran for over 400 miles from the Belgian coast to to Switzerland. This would be the Western Front that would dominate the war in Europe. It had taken just 3 months for both sides to fight themselves to a standstill. But just because they'd ground to a halt, it didn't mean the fighting had stopped. On the contrary, things were about to get a lot worse. In August 1914, Germany went to war believing it could storm through Belgium and take Paris in 6 weeks. But by October, that plan was in ruins, and both sides were now deadlocked and digging in for a long, hard fight ahead. The initial grand German plan may have failed, but that didn't bring an end to the hostilities. In fact, the opposite occurred. A whole new kind of fighting began to evolve, and we got our first taste of it right here in the beautiful Belgian city of Ypres. This is the pride of Ypres, the magnificent cloth hall built in the 13th century. And then built again to the original design. Because this is what happened to it during World War I. Ypres had the misfortune to lie in the path of the German army's latest initiative. It was devised by their new Commander-General, Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn. And his plan would take industrial war to a whole new nightmarish level. Von Falkenhayn knew that the capture of the ports would starve the Allies into submission. As such, here was a chance to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. So he sent 6 divisions, 250,000 men, to smash their way through Ypres to the coast.
Falkenhayn says, we are going to launch a new offensive in Belgium. And this time we're just going to smash this little British army, and this is going to be the one that wins the war in 1914. And suddenly the British find themselves in the very cockpit of the war. And all through October and November, they attack, and the German army suffers terrible casualties and inflicts terrible casualties on the British.
This incredible 3D photograph shows a scouting party of British troops approaching an enemy position on a rickety pontoon bridge on the outskirts of Ypres. By this point, 2/3 of the British soldiers who had arrived in France were either injured, missing, captured or killed. The ragged remnants were now facing the full fury of the German army. One thing that did give the BEF some hope against the superior number of German soldiers was the British troops' legendary skill in sharpshooting. Andy, you said the expeditionary force were good marksmen, and you've even provided a present-day weapons expert to show me how good.
Absolutely. This weapon here, they would be practicing really at about 300 yards. They had to be accurate at that range. We're going to be shooting here at 100 yards.
How much damage can they do?
Tremendous amount of damage. It'll punch a hole straight through a steel plate. We've got a 4mm plate down there. Plate behind that's 10mm thick, and it'll dent that.
You also said that they could fire these guns very fast.
They were trained to do what was called a mad minute. In other words, firing as many bullets as possible within a minute. And 15's a minimum. Many could do more than that. And during the fighting early in the war, when we were involved in open warfare with the Germans, sometimes we're told that the Germans believed we had lots of machine guns. Whatever it was, a very small number of British soldiers were able to pin down far greater numbers of Germans just by weight of fire.
Do you reckon you could do 15 in a minute? Go on then, have a go. Right, you ready? Fire!
They should be able to hit a target every time ready at 300 yards.
That's it. How many did you make that?
I made that 21.
Yeah, me too. 21, well done. Can we have the plates? Cheers, Matt. So this is the 10 mil.
So,
Oh, God,
and
blimey.
that's just not gone through, but making a hell of a dent in it.
Yeah, you can take that one back here.
That one's goes
And that's the 4 mil. Yeah, that is serious, isn't it?
straight through.
Even our cooks and company clerks had rifles put in their hands during the Battle of Ypres and were expected to keep up this tremendous display of firepower. As the German onslaught continued, the British ranks were ground down further, but still they fought on in ever more desperate circumstances. Sergeant F. Bell of the 2nd Gordon Highlanders was one of many British soldiers swept aside by the sheer number of enemy troops. We British were outnumbered by 7 to 1, he wrote. We were driven from the trench. I'd only gone 6 yards when I thought I'd been violently knocked on the head. Feeling I wasn't running properly, I looked down and discovered my right foot was missing. I saw British dead, mostly Highlanders, and as they lay there in their uniforms, I thought how young and lonely they looked. The British Expeditionary Force at Ypres was being bled to the bone. It needed help, and it needed it fast. So back in London, an emergency plan was put into place. And on Halloween night, 1914, a new force entered the battlefield. It offered a glimpse into the future and arrived in a rather bizarre form of transport. If you don't believe me, here's the proof. Look. A top deck full of Tommies with their bus parked up behind the rolling stock, bringing the food and fuel for the men at the front. So why London buses? I asked Tim Shield of the London Transport Museum to keep me up to speed. Where did all these buses come from?
So before the outbreak of war, as early as 1906, 1907, the army recognised the importance of moving troops very, very quickly, and trials were undertaken with motor buses. So when war did break out, there were buses that could be requisitioned at very short notice.
How fast could they go?
So a bus like this was designed for a top speed of 12 miles per hour. You could push it to about 16. If you went any faster, you'd be out of control going down a hill.
That seems really, really slow, doesn't it?
It seems very slow today in comparison, but 100 years ago, 12 miles an hour, that was really, really quite fast, almost warp speed in comparison to something like a horse bus, which would have a top speed of maybe 4 or 5 miles per hour.
I suppose one of the most obvious things about this bus is that it's bright red. That must have been a bit dangerous.
The vast majority were painted in khaki before they left. Some were painted as they were being transferred to France, but 1 or 2 did survive and did end up in France unpainted, at least on the first day of arrival.
It was buses like these that brought the troops of the London Scottish TA Regiment to the fight. The TAs were a relatively new force made up of volunteers and ex-servicemen. And they arrived at the battlefield on Halloween night 1914 for a true baptism of fire. When they arrived, they were thrown straight into the battle. It was pitch dark. The only light came from the burning hayricks and blazing windmills. They were engaged in vicious hand-to-hand fighting. Everything was chaos. Next morning, only 300 men, including the injured, turned up at roll call. That's 300 out of the 700 who'd arrived the night before. But it had worked. The line had held. The British held out for 2 weeks. Then in mid-November, the winter finally put a stop to the operation. And the Germans went back to their trenches. Ypres cost the BEF 30,000 wounded, 8,000 confirmed dead, and 18,000 missing or captured. The British Army couldn't cope with those kinds of losses. The professional soldiers, recruited and trained for another age, had fought the first modern war and been decimated by it. From now on, this conflict would be fought by a different kind of soldier. It would be fought by volunteers. So maybe now's the time to stand back and ask a few questions, like why did the war start and were we right to join in? Now, I'd always been told that it was the Germans who had started the war and they were absolutely bristling for a fight. But it now seems that things weren't as clear-cut and black and white as that. On the other hand, what about the allegations of atrocities levelled against the Germans at the beginning of the war? I'd always thought that was propaganda from our side to gee up our men. It now seems, though, that atrocities did actually take place, albeit not on the scale that they did in the Second World War. Nevertheless, was that justification enough for us to intervene? We've intervened in wars recently for very similar reasons, and the consequences have been disastrous. It's a tough call, isn't it? Our story of the war began with the death of a boy on a bicycle in Belgium. This is where he's buried. Down here, you've got the grave of Private John Parr, who was the very first British soldier to die in World War I. But take a look over here. It's an eerie coincidence. It's ironic, really. This is the gravestone of George Ellison. Now, George went to France at the same time as John. They were both in the original British Expeditionary Force together. But George didn't die until the 11th of November 1918, the very last day of the war, just 90 minutes before the guns were finally silenced. So you've got the first British soldier to die in the war and the last British soldier to die in the war, and between them you've got 4 years and round about 1 million dead soldiers from the British Empire. In the next episode, I go into the trenches with Kitchener's volunteers, look at the war in the skies and trace the story of the Somme.
Stories of a giant walking creature have been told for centuries from Tibet to North America. Coming up now on SBS One, we explore the missing evidence surrounding the mysterious Bigfoot.